Welcome to Mr. Bing Watch channel. My name is Mr. Bing, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you see on security footage. This is not a fictional tale. This is not creative writing. What you're about to hear is documented by video evidence that still exists to this day. Evidence that has been reviewed by multiple witnesses. Evidence that changed the lives of 5 employees forever. This is episode 1 of a 6-episode series called The First Year: Whispers on the Security Camera. Before we dive into this story, I need you to understand something. By the end of this episode, you'll want answers. You'll want to know what happens next, and you will get those answers, but only if you subscribe to this channel right now, because the remaining 5 episodes will explain everything. They will reveal the truth about what happened at Riverside Hardware over the course of 1 year. They will show you footage that defies explanation. They will introduce you to entities that should not exist in our world. But we start here. We start with the first year. We start with the whispers. So lean in close. Make sure you're comfortable. And please, before we begin, like this video and subscribe, because you're going to want to hear what comes next. Now let me tell you about Riverside Hardware. It was October 10th when the celebration happened. Exactly 1 year to the day since the store opened. Riverside Hardware wasn't a big box retailer. It was a local shop on the corner of 5th and Main in a town called Millbrook, population 8,000. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone. The kind of place where a new store opening was an event. Jake Martinez had been the manager for the entire year. He was 32 years old, with kind eyes and the kind of patience that came from genuinely caring about people. He'd hired 4 employees during the store's first month. Sarah, who worked the register and had a sharp sense of humour. Michael, who handled inventory and rarely spoke unless it was important. David, the oldest of the group at 54, who'd worked retail his entire life. And Emma, who was fresh out of high school and still figuring out what she wanted from life. They were a small team, but they were tight. They'd weathered the first year together. The rough opening, the slow sales, the moments when Jake wondered if the store would survive. Now, on the anniversary, he wanted to celebrate them. "Okay, people, gather around," Jake called out as closing time approached that evening. The store was empty of customers. The sun had set outside, leaving only the glow of streetlights on the parking lot. The team assembled in the break room, a small space with a card table, a refrigerator that hummed constantly, and walls that had seen better days. Jake produced a sheet cake from the back. It wasn't fancy. It was from the local grocery store bakery, but it had Riverside Hardware, 1 year strong, written on it in blue icing. Emma smiled genuinely when she saw it. Sarah started clapping. Michael offered a small nod of appreciation. David just shook his head with a slight grin. "We made it," Jake said simply. 1 year. Do you guys know what that means? 1 year in retail is like 5 years anywhere else. We survived together. We're still here. Because we're gluttons for punishment, Sarah said with a laugh. Working minimum wage with a manager who's almost as tired as we are. Jake threw a napkin at her, and the room erupted in laughter. For a moment, it felt like everything was perfect. Like they'd accomplished something real. As they ate cake and told stories about the first year, the delivery mix-up that resulted in 200 hammers arriving on the wrong day, the elderly woman who asked if they sold electricity, the time a customer got stuck in the bathroom, the conversation shifted. Michael was the one who brought it up. "Remember those stories about this building?" he said casually. "Before we opened here." The room went quiet. "What stories?" Emma asked, her fork halfway to her mouth.
"Oh, nothing concrete," David said, but Jake noticed him exchanging a look with Michael. "Just rumors. This building had a history before it was Riverside Hardware. Different businesses tried to open here, none of them lasted long. How long are we talking? Sarah asked, her curiosity clearly engaged. Shortest was 3 months, David said. Longest was maybe 2 years. The building just... He paused, searching for the right word. Wasn't conducive to business. That's what people said. The location didn't work. Energy was off. Whatever. Energy, Sarah repeated flatly. The building's energy was off. Look, I'm just saying what I heard at the grocery store, David said defensively. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm just saying people talk. Small towns have stories. Jake had heard these rumors too, but he'd dismissed them. He needed this store to work. He couldn't afford to believe in things like bad energy or cursed locations, but he'd noticed something in their first year, a certain reluctance in customers to linger. They came in, got what they needed, and left, quickly. He'd attributed it to the store's layout, to the lack of a cafe area, to any number of rational explanations. So what you're saying is we're working in a haunted hardware store, Emma said, and she was half joking, but her voice had risen slightly in pitch. Nobody said haunted, Michael said quietly. Just, the business didn't last, that's all. The conversation moved on after that, but something had shifted in the room. The celebration felt a little less celebratory. As they cleaned up and prepared to close for the night, Jake made a decision. It was probably silly, but he wanted to dispel the tension. He wanted to remind everyone that this was just a normal building with a normal history. Hey, you guys want to see something? He said, heading toward his office. I've got security footage from opening day. I was reviewing the tapes yesterday, and some of it is actually pretty funny. You know, watching yourselves from a year ago. Sarah perked up immediately. Oh, God, please tell me you have footage of Michael trying to use the cash register on day one. I have footage of all of you, Jake said, returning with his laptop. He set it on the card table and pulled up the security system. The store had 4 cameras, one at the front entrance, one at the register, one at the back stock room, and one in the middle of the main floor. Okay, opening day, morning shift, Jake said, navigating to October 10th of the previous year. Let me find the moment we turned the lights on for the first time. The footage appeared on screen. All 4 angles of the store arranged in a 2x2 grid. The store was dark and empty and still looked brand new. Then, at 8:47 a.m., according to the timestamp, the lights came on. Sarah appeared first, looking nervous in that way new employees do. Then Michael, then David, then Emma, who was carrying a box and tripped slightly as she set it down. The employees gathered around the laptop, pointing out details and laughing at their younger, more nervous selves. They watched as they'd opened register drawers and arranged merchandise and learned the systems. It was nostalgic and funny, and exactly the kind of thing that Jake had hoped for, a reminder of where they'd started. This is making me feel old, Sarah said. I look like a baby in this footage. You were a baby, David pointed out. You still basically are. They cycled through more footage. Morning shifts from the first week, evening closings, Saturday rushes where the store was fuller than they'd ever imagined it. The mood in the break room lightened considerably. They were laughing, reminiscing, enjoying themselves. But then Jake noticed something. It was subtle, so subtle that he almost missed it. But in the background of one of the stockroom camera feeds from about 3 weeks into their opening, there was a sound, a whisper, just barely audible underneath the normal ambient noise of the store. Jake paused the footage. Did anyone else hear that? Hear what? Emma asked. That sound in the background. Jake rewound the footage a few seconds and played it again, turning up the volume on the laptop. The stockroom came into view. It was empty, just shelves of inventory and boxes. But there it was again. A whisper. Not words exactly. Just the sound of a voice, low and indistinct, like someone was speaking just barely below the threshold of clarity. That's probably just the building settling, Michael said, but he was frowning. Or whined outside. In the stockroom, Jake said, with all the doors closed? Could be an outside door we didn't hear, David suggested, but his voice carried doubt. Sarah had gone very quiet, staring at the paused footage. Can you rewind and show us the other cameras at that same timestamp? Jake did as she asked. He pulled up all 4 camera feeds synchronized to the same moment. In the stockroom, nothing was visible except shelves and boxes. In the front of the store, it was empty. The register camera showed nothing. The main floor camera showed nothing. But all 4 feeds, when played simultaneously, carried that same whisper, the same indistinct voice, speaking from everywhere and nowhere. That's weird, Emma said softly. It's a malfunction, Michael said quickly. The audio system is probably picking up interference from something, radio frequency interference or something. From what? Jake asked. We don't have a radio in here. The nearest radio would be in someone's car in the parking lot. Electrical interference then, David said, from the power lines. Power lines that also transmit the same audio through 4 separate camera feeds? Sarah said. She was looking at Jake now, and he could see the same unease he felt reflected in her eyes. Guys, that's not how audio interference works. Jake's rational mind wanted to agree with Michael and David, wanted to find a logical explanation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this. He pulled up more footage, later that week, then the following week, then the week after, and in random clips scattered throughout their opening month, he found the whispers again. Sometimes just a faint sound, barely distinguishable from static, other times clearer, but always coming from all 4 cameras simultaneously, always in places where no one should be speaking, always after hours when the store was closed and locked up tight. How many times does this happen? Sarah asked, her voice tighter now. Jake scrolled through weeks of footage, pulling clips whenever he heard the whisper. He found 23 instances in the first month alone. 23 moments where something or someone was speaking in their store when no one should be there. Okay, this is officially creepy, Emma said, and her hand had found Sarah's arm. She was holding on like it was a lifeline. It's nothing, Michael insisted, but he was shifting uncomfortably in his chair. It has to be something technical. I'm going to call the security company, Jake said quietly. Tomorrow. I'm going to ask them about this. But he already knew what they'd say. He already knew they'd find nothing wrong with the system. Some part of him knew that as soon as he called, the explanation would slip away like smoke. The logical answer would evaporate, leaving him with only the impossible one. What if... Sarah started, then stopped. No, never mind. What if what? David pressed. What if it's related to the building's history? Sarah finished. What if something happened here before we opened and it's... She gestured helplessly. Still here? That's insane, Michael said immediately. Is it? Sarah countered. We just watched footage of something speaking in this store when nobody was here. We heard it with our own ears. I don't know what that is, but insane is clearly not working as an explanation anymore. Jake wanted to shut down this line of conversation, wanted to get everyone to go home and pretend this night had ended differently. But he couldn't, because Sarah was right. The rational explanations weren't holding up anymore. Let me check more footage, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his chest. Different time periods. Let me see if there's a pattern. Over the next 30 minutes, Jake navigated through security footage spanning the entire year, and what he found made his blood run cold. The whispers didn't start in October. He found instances of them in July, August, and September before the store even opened, before the building was converted into Riverside Hardware. He found whispers in the empty building, in rooms that were being renovated, in spaces that no living person had been working in at the time the audio was recorded. And slowly, subtly, over the course of the year, the whispers were getting clearer, getting louder, getting more intentional. This is insane, Emma whispered. We've been working in this store for a year, and something has been here the whole time. Maybe the whole time plus before, David said quietly. Maybe it's been here long before we arrived. Jake knew he needed to find the most recent footage, needed to see if the escalation was continuing. His hands were shaking as he navigated to that day's footage, to the security recordings from just a few hours earlier while they were celebrating their anniversary, before they knew something was wrong. He played the main floor camera from 6:00 p.m., right around when they'd started eating cake in the break room. The store was empty except for the 5 of them in the back. It should have been silent, but as he listened, he heard it again, the whisper. But this time, it was different. This time, it was clear enough to almost be words, clear enough that they could hear inflection and emotion and intent. Jake turned up the volume as high as it would go, played it again. The whisper stretched across the speakers, indistinct but powerful. And underneath all the static and distortion, there was something they could almost understand. What is it saying? Sarah breathed. Jake played it again, and slowly, with each repetition, the words began to crystallize. The whisper began to form actual syllables, actual phonemes, actual meaning. All 4 employees leaned in closer to the laptop screen. The break room had gone completely silent. Outside, the streetlights hummed their monotonous song. Inside, they waited for the message to become clear. One more time. Jake played it one more time, and this time, they heard it. Crystal clear, unmistakable. A voice that came from all 4 camera feeds simultaneously, speaking directly into their store, directly into their gathering, directly into their lives. Leave before it's too late. The words hung in the air between them. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The screen continued to play, but the whisper had stopped. The footage showed an empty store, but the message had been delivered. That's... Emma couldn't finish her sentence. Not possible, Michael said, but his voice had lost all conviction. Sarah looked at Jake. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Jake saw something in her face that mirrored exactly what he felt. A dawning realization. A creeping sense that they'd just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. That they'd just heard something that couldn't be unheard. That they'd just stepped into something much larger and much darker than any of them had imagined. Okay, Jake said quietly, closing the laptop. Okay, this is happening. Whatever this is, it's real, and it's happening. What do we do? Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. We don't tell anyone, Michael said quickly. We can't tell anyone. They'll think we're crazy. We come back tomorrow, David said, and his voice carried a tone of resignation, as if he'd always known something like this was coming. We come back, and we figure out what this place is, what it wants, why it wants us to leave. And if we can't figure it out? Sarah asked. Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to consider what would happen if they couldn't figure it out, if the voice in the walls kept getting clearer, if the message kept getting more insistent, if they reached the end of the year and heard something even worse than what was already happening in their store. Jake looked at the closed laptop, looked at his team, looked around the break room where they'd been celebrating just minutes earlier, when the world had still made sense, when hardware stores were just hardware stores, when security footage was just video recordings of everyday commerce. This is going to get worse, he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Whatever this is, it's not going to stop. The whispers are getting clearer. The message is getting stronger. By the time we've been open for 2 years, we might be able to have a full conversation with whatever this is. Then we need to document it, Sarah said suddenly. We need to save the footage. We need to be prepared for what's coming. She's right, David agreed. If we're going to survive this, we need to understand it. We need to track it. We need to know everything about what's happening in this store. Emma looked terrified, but she nodded slowly. So, we're doing this? We're staying? We're investigating? Jake thought about his store. Thought about the year they'd just survived together. Thought about the fact that this location had destroyed every business before them. Thought about the fact that they'd made it a year, which meant they'd already lasted longer than most. Yeah, he said finally. We're doing this. We're staying. We're investigating. And we're going to figure out what's happening here. But even as he said it, he knew he was lying. He knew they didn't have a choice, because the voice had already made it clear. Leave before it's too late, which meant that the longer they stayed, the less likely leaving would become an option, which meant that whatever was happening at Riverside Hardware was only going to get darker, only going to get more intense, only going to pull them deeper into something they couldn't escape. The screen of the closed laptop sat dark and silent on the break room table. The security system continued to record, and somewhere in the building, in the walls and the shadows and the spaces between moments, something whispered. Something that had been waiting a very long time for new tenants. Something that had plans for Riverside Hardware. Something that had just given them a warning they should have heeded. Leave before it's too late. But Jake had a terrible feeling that it was already too late. That the moment they'd all stepped through those doors on opening day, the moment had become fixed. The ending had already been written, and now they were just living through the story, watching it unfold, powerless to stop it. And behind them, in episode 2, the whispers would get even clearer. If you made it this far, you need to subscribe right now, because episode 2 is coming, and it will answer some of your questions while asking horrifying new ones. The whispers will become audible. The message will become unmistakable. And the employees will discover that what's happening at Riverside Hardware is connected to something far larger than any of them imagined. Like this video. Comment below and tell me what you think is happening. Tell me if you've ever experienced something similar. Tell me if you believe in the impossible. And please, whatever you do, don't miss episode 2, because the whispers are just the beginning. This is Mr. Bing Watch Channel. I'll see you in the next episode. The story continues.